The Subcommittee on Housing and Community Development will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing is entitled Persistent Poverty in America, Addressing Chronic Disinvestment in Colonias, the Southern Black Belt, and the U.S. territories. I now recognize the ranking member. I'm sorry. I recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Persistent poverty is a major problem in this country. And in counties around the country, they have a rate of poverty that has exceeded 20% for 30 years or more in a row of the country's 377 persistent poverty counties. The vast majority are in rural and non-metro areas. The millions of Americans grappling with persistent poverty are diverse. They're located in Appalachia, communities in states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Native American communities in states like South Dakota, Latino communities in states like Texas, African American communities in states like South Carolina and Alabama, and in the U.S. territories. These Americans are represented in Congress by Democrats and Republicans, and by Democratic and Republican members of this committee. Addressing persistent poverty is in the interest of all Americans, regardless of geography, race, or political preference. And addressing persistent poverty is a significant challenge, despite flows in the economy, in good economic times and in bad. Persistent poverty areas of the country are struggling, resistant to time and effort. Democrats continue to advocate for rural America and the territories. Under the leadership of Chairwoman Waters, the Financial Services Committee passed the Build Back Better Act, which would have made a historic level of investments in rural and persistent poverty areas. The housing title of the bill would have specifically provided over $100 billion in fair and affordable housing investments throughout the United States. This would have included $2.1 billion for housing and home ownership preservation to increase the supply of housing and provide rental assistance in rural communities through the USDA, as well as $500 million for infrastructure improvements in manufactured housing communities, and $700 million for housing and community development investment in colonias, including those located outside of the 150-mile area from the United States-Mexican border through the Community Development Block Grant Program. Territories would have received a significant portion of these investments through required minimum allocations. I hope that this hearing will dive deeper into the financial solutions and the federal solutions on this table and the full range of tools at our disposal. Chair now recognizes the ranking member for 4 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Appreciate today's topic of the hearing, persistent poverty in America. This topic is certainly an important one, and it's a troubling one. According to the Census Bureau, the national poverty rate was 12.8% in 2021, with about 37 million people in our nation in poverty, up more than 3 million from the prior year. It might be hard for some to fathom in a country so blessed with abundance that there are still so many places where poverty not only exists, but where it's taken root and shows no sign of relenting. These places are remnants of more forgotten time in America before the economic boom that for many dominated the latter half of the 20th century and carries on today. And despite the specificity of the title of today's hearing, these deeply impoverished areas can sadly be found in all corners of our great nation, from the southeast counties of the bluegrass state of Kentucky to the Native American reservations of central South Dakota, western Alaska on the Bering Sea coast, and in my home state of Arkansas. These places might not all look alike, but they do share at least one major characteristic. They are, for many purposes, all rural in nature, and for many, extremely so. So in a lot of ways, what we're really talking about here today is the impact of poverty in rural America. And more to the point, the question we need to be asking is, why does poverty seem to hit those living in the country with such a tremendous impact over those in impoverished urban areas like the South Bronx or Detroit? I'm not sure we'll ever be able to answer that important question here today, but let me make a couple of observations. First, the high levels of poverty we see in these rural areas of our nation, despite 60 years of focused federal efforts to eradicate them, continue. The Department of Agriculture's Rural Housing Service was created in 1949 to build or improve housing and essential community facilities in rural areas. That was followed in 1965 by HUD's efforts under Urban Renewal and Sergeant Shriver and the Commerce Department's EDA, all to try to help economically distressed areas in cities. In fact, if you go back to the launch of the federal government's 1960s war on poverty, President Johnson boldly proclaimed, "We have declared an unconditional war on poverty. Our objective is total victory." I believe that 30 years from now, Americans will look back on these 1960s as the time of a great American breakthrough towards victory of prosperity over poverty. Well, $22 trillion later, I'm reminded of President Reagan's quip from 1988. President Johnson declared war on poverty, and poverty won. So these were lofty goals by President Johnson, but after 60 years and hundreds of billions, so as I say, $22 trillion in inflation-adjusted spending, big government approaches to battling poverty for not worked for many rural households. So it seems to me it's a great time to rethink this strategy as we try to tackle it. We can no longer define success by annual increases in funding levels for programs that fail to elevate families out of poverty. Instead, we should focus on what's likely to be the most effective way to combat it: greater development and deployment of economic opportunity, including broadband, better available education in these rural areas, private lending and investment, and job creation. You know, in Arkansas, I've seen that success, Mr. Chairman. One of the poorest counties in the 1st District of Arkansas in the Mississippi Delta is now the world's largest producer of steel. And hundreds of people are employed, and that economic prosperity in that corridor from Memphis to the Missouri border is growing because of those kinds of investments. So I thank my chairman for this hearing. I look forward to the discussion, and I yield back to it.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full Committee of Financial Services, the Honorable Maxine Waters, California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cleaver, for this hearing. Over 1.7 million people in the U.S. live in rural counties experiencing persistent poverty. These rural communities face chronic disinvestment and population loss as housing, lending, and community development needs have gone ignored. We cannot continue to turn a blind eye, especially as inflation, driven in large part by rising housing costs nationwide, has exacerbated rural job loss, further entrenching persistent poverty in many communities. 1 year ago this month, the House passed the Build Back Better Act, which included historic investments for housing in rural America. But not one single Republican member supported it. I hope we can build bipartisan support for efforts to invest in affordable housing, especially in rural areas, and to effectively reduce inflation. And I hope, as we go down this path for the future, that we can get some support from the Republicans. Thank you. Yield back.
The chairwoman yields back. First, we have on our, as our witness, Mr. Yarimar Bonilla, who is the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. Next, we have Burt, who is the vice president of Policy and Advocacy and interim director at the Hope Policy Institute. Next, we have Lance George, who is the director of research and information at the Housing Assistance Council. And then finally, we have Chris Potterpin, who is the president of the development at PK Companies. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer that will indicate how much time you have left. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer so that we can be respectful of witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. Mr. Bonilla, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Yarimar Bonilla. I'm the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, the largest research institute and archive devoted to the Puerto Rican experience. I am grateful for the invitation to testify today on the question of persistent poverty and chronic disinvestment in the U.S. territories. Though given the time limit and the data challenges, I will focus narrowly on Puerto Rico. When I gathered with my team to present this testimony, the first question we asked ourselves was, is persistent poverty really the right term for thinking about Puerto Rico's challenges? The U.S. government has set 20% for 30 years as the trigger of an alarm, but the fact is that Puerto Rico's poverty rate has been twice that for over half a century. At 40.5%, Puerto Rico has the second highest poverty rate in the U.S., second only to American Samoa, and the absolute lowest median income of any U.S. jurisdiction. A full quarter of the Puerto Rican population subsists on just $10,000 a year. Some assume that these depressed incomes are tied to lower costs of living, but the contrary is true. Rent, mortgage, and utility burdens are all higher in Puerto Rico than the national average. The U.S. territories as a whole share these concerning metrics, leading us to ask whether this is really a question of persistent poverty, or rather of the systemic poverty of empire. Sadly, those most impacted by poverty and inequality are Puerto Rico's children. A whopping 55% of Puerto Rican children are living in poverty, 60% in rural areas. It has been shown that the best way to attend to income inequality is to ensure access to public infrastructure and services like education that facilitate upward mobility. However, in Puerto Rico, acute poverty rates have been met by a systemic disinvestment in public infrastructure due to austerity measures, leading to the closing of schools, the defunding of the university system, and the privatization of essential infrastructure such as roads, tolls, and energy distribution. Since the privatization of the grid in 2021, outages have become commonplace, even as utility costs rise. This has impacted education, healthcare, communications, sales, and even the preparation of this testimony. Just yesterday, one of our researchers was among the hundreds of thousands without electricity due to yet another mass power outage. The toughest part of all of this is that those who fail to provide us with the most basic of services, services which arguably should be guaranteed human rights, seem to operate with complete impunity. Although many wring their hands and accept this as the unfortunate fate of life in the colonies, we remind the members of Congress that the U.S. Constitution grants them the singular power to change the lives of millions of citizens and nationals that reside in the territories. The Supreme Court has established that Congress has the power and authority to treat territories differently than the states. This has historically been interpreted as a congressional right to treat the territories worse by leaving them out of critical federal programs while failing to address their systemically depressed incomes. However, Congress could just as easily treat the territories better by attending to the demographic particularities and historic legacies of systemic dispossession. If the U.S. government recognizes that a persistent poverty rate of over 20% for 3 decades warrants federal action, we request that the committee ponder what is necessary to attend to communities that have had twice that rate for multiple generations. To begin, Congress must exercise its oversight role to critically examine the impact of the fiscal board it created. What has been the tangible impact and long-term consequences of the focus on austerity and privatization? Further, since the board conceded that a large portion of Puerto Rico's debt was unconstitutional, why is it forcing Puerto Ricans to pay it, and refusing to have it audited. In addition, HUD and FEMA must be held accountable and work in better partnership with local watchdogs. Discrimination and excessive scrutiny of Puerto Rican agencies and applicants in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria had been widely documented, and yet we already hear the same issues are unfolding in the wake of Hurricane Fiona. Lastly, Congress must address the exclusion of Puerto Rico and other U.S. territories from federal programs like SSI and other federal benefits geared at precisely the most disadvantaged sectors of the population. Otherwise, it should speak clearly on what moral grounds residents of the territories are excluded from these entitlements. Again, Congress can treat territories differently. It should use that power. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, thank you. Mr. Burt, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you. Good morning, and thank you to the committee for having me here today. My name is Kiyadh Burt, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy and the Interim Director of Hope Policy Institute. Since 1994, Hope has worked to increase financial inclusion among the most vulnerable populations in the Deep South. Deep South states of Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, a region that is home to 1/3 of this nation's persistent poverty counties, mostly which are rural. Hope is also one of the largest Black and women-owned financial institutions in this country, and on behalf of the organization, I'm here today to discuss the strategies to increase affordable home ownership and housing in this region with the emphasis on increasing opportunities for communities of color. The first strategy in increasing home ownership and affordable housing concerns down payment assistance. In the Deep South, there is nearly a 27% difference between Black and white home ownership. Largely due to financial exclusion and exploitative practices, many Black and brown communities simply lack adequate capital to purchase a home. Now, down payment assistance is a critical strategy in resolving that gap. Down payment assistance has the ability to transition households from a history of renting to a future of home ownership. Now, Hope is familiar with the positive impact of down payment assistance, particularly through our experience with the Neighborhood Lift program, a partnership between Wells Fargo and the NeighborWorks America organization to increase the number of first-time home buyers, particularly among communities of color. In our experience, when we see an increase in down payment assistance program, we see a clear correlation in the increase of homeowners of color. The second strategy ensures that we must ensure that banks and credit unions offer mortgage products that meet the needs of communities that often find themselves in rural, persistent poverty counties, and also that a secondary market supports those efforts. Hope has an in-house mortgage product that meets the challenges of communities that often lack access to down payments. This product is manually underwritten, it discounts student loan deferred debt, and it also has a loan-to-value ratio of 100%, effectively eliminate the down payment disparities and challenges. Now, what's interesting about our product is that the GSEs, Freddie Mae, and Fannie Mac, do not support the flexibility of this product. Now, their inability to purchase these loans really speaks to the lack of capacity to provide increased home ownership for these communities, and it also limits our ability to expand our capacity to lend to these communities by the failure of them to purchase this loan product. And then lastly, for a strategy, we must hold state housing finance agencies accountable for meeting pandemic recovery needs of local people. An examination of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program shows that state governments in the Deep South did not meet the needs of local people in the distribution of rental assistance at levels achieved across the country. Such findings call for increased accountability among states, particularly states with questionable track records in serving the most vulnerable populations. In conclusion, communities in America's Black Belt have long endured persistent poverty and its associated ills. However, the communities and these institutions that serve them have demonstrated the expertise to mitigate the effects of race in place, most often with significantly fewer resources than other parts of the country. CDFIs with a track record of reaching and working with communities in partnership model solutions that work. With adequate resources supporting these institutions and increased commitment by others to do the same, it is possible to ensure prosperity and mobility in the most economically stressed communities in this country.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from Ms. Arriaga-Salinas. You have 5 minutes to present your oral testament.
Good morning. Chair and members, thank you for this opportunity. I am Amber Arriaga-Salinas, Assistant Executive Director at Proyecto Azteca. We are a nonprofit construction company based in San Juan, Texas, and our mission is to provide affordable housing for low-income families who cannot obtain a traditional mortgage. Our goal is to empower them to become responsible homeowners and move away from poverty to prosperity. Colonias are substandard, isolated developments where residents lacked basic services like potable drinking water, sewage treatment, electricity, paved roads, adequate drainage, street lights, sidewalks, and decent housing. Cheap former agricultural land was sold to low-income families, and developers were not required to improve infrastructure. Health, safety, economic, and housing challenges plagued thousands of Colonia residents by the end of the 1970s. There are approximately 200,000 people living in Hidalgo County colonias. They are an industrious, hardworking, and family-oriented people, but it's not uncommon for residents to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. There is a low rate of conventional homelessness, but we do see a great deal of overcrowding. In 1996, the state legislature began to implement model subdivision rules where many improvements were made, but colonias still lack safe, decent, and affordable housing. There is a great deal of persistent poverty despite decades of economic growth. In 1977, research showed that there was 40% of families living in poverty, but today we believe that it has not changed. The McAllen and Edinburgh metropolitan areas are some of the poorest in the country. There is very limited public transportation, and owning a vehicle is a necessity for Colonia residents in order to maintain a job, go to school, shop for groceries, and visit the doctor. Drainage improvements cannot keep up with the rapid growth. As buildings, parking lots, and highways grow, there's less space to divert water. And because colonias are isolated, the issues are magnified. There are many health challenges associated with flooding, such as diseases and increased mental distress. Although the infrastructure is poor in colonias, we did see a great deal of improvements in great part to the Colonia Ombudsman program that the state unfortunately vetoed in 2016. Housing is the most important component that determines the family's quality of life, and communities cannot thrive when so many live in unstable conditions. We ask that a program like the State Colonia Ombudsman program be revived in order to track improvements, and colonias would have a greater opportunity to address affordability, equity, and sustainability problems if the term colonia were included in the Federal Housing Finance Agency's duty to serve definitions. Build Back Better and the American Rescue Plan monies provided great relief for families that we serve. However, federal dollars are designated to address homelessness and rental assistance, and the definitions do not address the needs of housing in colonias. Rental units are limited to families in colonias. Rental vouchers outside city limits are not available. Rentals in colonias actually consist of travel trailers parked in lawns. Funds should be set aside and in order to specifically address the unique need for affordable housing and community development in colonias. I sped through. I was nervous.
Thank you very much. Mr. George Potterpin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Waters, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and members of the subcommittee, greetings and thank you for this opportunity to testify on the issue of persistent poverty in America. My name is Lance George, and I'm the Director of Research and Information at the Housing Assistance Council. The Housing Assistance Council, often referred to by our acronym HAC, is a national nonprofit corporation that supports affordable housing efforts in rural areas of the United States and the territories. Inherent to HAC is our longstanding attention to persistently poor rural areas and people. HAC's effort in these communities have been at the core of our work since our founding over 50 years ago. In addition to HAC's direct services, we continually assess and study the issue of persistent poverty to help inform strategies and solutions for these important communities. We know the members of this subcommittee are knowledgeable on the issue of persistent poverty, but we wish to highlight 5 quick trends that we believe are key to improving social and economic and housing conditions in these communities. Number 1, areas of persistent poverty are not random and are geographically clustered. While seemingly invisible to much of the nation, persistent poverty counties make up 1/10 of all counties and 15% of our nation's landmass. Number 2, persistent poverty areas are fluid. According to HAC's recent estimates, 70 counties moved off of the persistent poverty list, while 13 counties newly reached this threshold. But approximately 78% of current persistent poverty counties have been in this state consistently since 1980, although I would note there has been a dramatic reduction of these counties over the last 40 or 50 years. Number 3, poverty is not new to the territories. Because of the focus of this hearing, HAC would also like to highlight that for the first time, we calculated persistent poverty status for Puerto Rico. All 78 of Puerto Rico's municipos were classified as having persistent poverty in 2020. Number 4, race and ethnicity are closely aligned with the persistence of poverty. 60% of people living in persistent poverty counties are people of color, and 42% of persistent poverty counties have majority populations of color. And finally, trend number 5, the visible impact of economic distress is evidenced in the housing conditions in these communities. The incidence of housing units lacking adequate plumbing is twice the national rate, and over 380,000 households in persistent poverty counties live in crowded conditions. Additionally, more than half of persistent poverty renters experience affordability challenges. Mortgage and housing finance are similarly unbalanced. Low levels of loan applications and loan originations and high rates of loan denials and high-cost lending are prevalent in many persistent poverty counties. Persistently poor communities face regional and local challenges, yet importantly have unique assets, strengths, and opportunities to combat geographic inequality. HAC recommends proactively considering geographic factors in federal policymaking. In our experience, and given the persistent poverty landscape outlined before, there are 2 critical factors necessary to build equity in persistently poor rural places. The first is just local organizational capacity. Second is access to capital. Additionally, tailoring of federal resources and improving the reliability and availability of rural data would also improve equity for persistent poverty communities. An example of this importance of data are HAC's development of the Colonias investment areas. This research created a usable and programmatic definition of Colonia so that mortgage and housing finance resources can be more efficiently directed to Colonia community. In closing, I would ask for indulgence for the subcommittee to add a personal note. I grew up and lived the first 18 years of my life in Lewis County, Kentucky, a persistently poor county in Appalachia that has experienced very high poverty rates since the 1960s and before. I wish to be clear, I did not live in poverty as a child. But I have family, friends, and acquaintances who were poor and continue to live in poverty in the place that I love. And while the residents of Lewis County, like those from every persistent poverty community, suffer from distressed economies, under-resourced systems, and disinvestment, there are also rich cultural histories, perseverance, and a deep sense of pride in their community, and I share that pride. Through this paradox of perseverance and pain, HAC appreciates the subcommittee's attention and motivation to provide meaningful change to the condition of persistent poverty in rural America. And the Housing Assistance Council, most importantly, in collaboration with our community partners, stand ready to assist Congress towards this goal. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. George. Mr. Potterpin, thank you for your patience. We're trying to negotiate having witnesses here and those with us virtually, so thank you very much. You're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you.
Can you hold up, if you can hear me, hold up just a second. We're having a little technical issue here. Just hold on just a second. I think that may be on his end.
Can you guys
Mr. Potterpin, you may need to, we think that's on the problem is on your end. If you could maybe move closer to the Microphone, speaker just a bit louder.
Hello?
Yes, yes, if you could keep wherever you were when you said hello, stay there.
Okay, I'll stay right here.
Yes.
Apologies. All right. Thank you for that. Sorry for the difficulty there. On behalf of the Council for Affordable and Rural Housing, or CAR, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony in support of the efforts to address chronic disinvestment in the Colonias, the Southern Black Belt, and the U.S. territories. CAR focuses on housing investment and providing affordable housing, and that's going to be the focus of my testimony. CAR is an industry trade association with headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, representing the interests of for-profit builders, developers, management companies, and owners, as well as financial entities and suppliers of goods and services to the affordable rental housing industry in rural America. My company, PK Companies, based in Michigan, develops, manages, and owns approximately 5,000 units of affordable rural housing units in about 8 states. We are a second-generation company and committed to efficient and effective affordable rural housing. The members of this committee and the other witnesses have done a great job of describing the problem that the Southern Black Belt, the Colonias, the U.S. territories are facing, and I believe that these problems are expressed throughout all rural areas in this country. And there continues to be an overwhelming need for both affordable and decent housing. The lack of safe and decent housing in rural America is one of the greatest contributors to the challenge of poverty. The lack of affordable housing reflects the lack of investment in these localities more broadly. In fact, rural renters are more than twice as likely to live in substandard housing compared to people who own their own homes. In these areas, we are losing our affordable units. Loss of federally assisted multifamily housing means losing a finite resource, and that trend is contributing to challenges in rural areas. Most areas never had enough decent, safe, or affordable housing, and increasingly those that did are losing this resource. The adverse effects of housing instability, as I said, have been covered well in this hearing already, but I want to highlight the number one impact is on education and health of the country's greatest asset, the children, and it has been well documented. Neither the private nor the public sector can produce affordable rural housing independently of one another. There needs to be a partnership. We actually have a very good federal program built to address this already. Federal programs have been very effective when properly funded and supported with technology and government staff. Too often, these programs focusing on rural areas have been shorted as compared to their urban counterparts, and the agencies have been limited on staff levels and training resources. Specifically to housing in rural areas, we're talking about the USDA Rural Development Program, specifically the 514 and 515 loan programs and 521 rental assistance. They were reasonably well funded from their inception up until the mid-90s and produced a large number of housing units in rural areas. Since then, since the mid-90s, these programs have not seen proper funding. The majority of the existing projects that were built are now 30 plus years old with no way of preservation or rehabilitation outside of the housing tax credit, which predominantly goes to urban areas or suburban areas. We are already losing our affordable housing projects. We're down to less than 14,000 projects and properties. Over the next decade, as many as 3/4 of all Section 515 mortgages will mature. And with it, the end of rental assistance for the folks in those properties, and that will affect approximately 250,000 families and elderly persons, leaving them without the ability to house themselves. In 300 counties, Section 515 properties are the majority of project-based subsidized units, and 90% of all Section 515 properties are in counties with persistent poverty. We do have some tools available to help this problem. Rural development rental housing programs and the housing credit are the best tools we have to develop more housing and preserve the housing that we have. Section 521 is rental assistance for housing programs and currently subsidizes 63% of the 515 units that are created. We need to increase this number to 100%. Almost all of the residents that live in 515 housing that are not subsidized are overburdened. And that is a key tool to preserving the housing and using outside private resources to rehabilitate and preserve this housing for the next 30 years and stop it from becoming market rate housing and losing out of the program. We do need rural development needs more specific direction on how to use that rental assistance and using it for preservation of existing projects. We also need to modernize the housing credit to be able to be more focused towards rural and allowed to use for more rural projects. We need to allow LLCs and S corps to participate more fully in the housing credit and support relief. I know that I'm over now, but we do need to support the rural housing office with technology upgrades. Some of their programs are still from the 90s, and they need more staff there. They've been chronically understaffed. On behalf of CAR, I'd like to thank this committee for the opportunity to discuss rural housing issues with you today. And with a few relatively minor changes, we can provide the tools needed to continue successful partnerships and for affordable rural housing. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I want to begin with Mr. Burt. Based on your testimony, you have a lot of experience in dealing with this issue. What would you like to see that could help spur sustainable home ownership opportunities for people in rural communities facing persistent poverty?
I think we want to see more down payment assistance. Earlier in my testimony, I mentioned the Neighborhood Lift program. Through this program, we've been able to provide down payment assistance grants of up to $10,000 for 359 Mississippians. Approximately 1/4 of the mortgages originated were located in rural communities. 90% were to Black households, and 63% were to women-head households. This program is solid proof that down payment assistance is an opportunity to bridge the gap from renters to home ownership. We actually estimate that we can close the home ownership gap in the Deep South through funding of mortgages for 500,000 people of color. Now, achieving such a goal will require the funding and maintenance of a flexible down payment assistance program. And to date, we have seen no other set of proposals with the greater potential to close this gap than the Down Payment Towards Equity Act. This act appropriately targets down payment assistance to first-generation home buyers, people most in need of the equity boost to get into a home. We also remain excited about that opportunity and look forward to more possibilities to increasing down payment assistance, particularly for rural communities, people of color, and communities that find themselves in persistent poverty.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so I'm wondering, Mr. Potterpen, I may have misunderstood you, but you were saying in your testimony that a great deal of the money went into the urban areas and a not so significant amount went into the rural areas. Is that, did I interpret that correctly? Federal funds.
In regards to the housing tax credit program, yes, there are certain set-asides that provide housing in rural areas, but not compared to the population that lives in rural areas or reflecting the need or the challenges that the rural housing is facing.
Yeah, I represent, believe it or not, a large rural area of Missouri, and the problem is not, from my perspective, I'm interested in yours. It's not based on Washington making decisions about where the money is spent. The problem is based on the fact that we give the states federal funds to do exactly what you said needed to be done. And my interpretation is that the problem comes with the state. And, if the money goes into entitlement cities, CDBG, they go into entitlement cities. And so probably in most states, there may be 4 or 5 entitlement cities, with the exception of Texas, California, New York. But then these smaller communities have to go and fight it out. 200 or 300 smaller cities have to go and fight it out in their state capitals. And even then, they get a puny piece of the money.
Sure.
So if we're going to correct a problem, it needs to be with what's going on with the federal allocation to the states, because that's where the problem is most clearly seen. And I've been arguing this for a long time now, that we need to take a whole different view of this. You know, even if you got to do community development block grants, the states will have to, since they are not entitled, they have to go out and fight a little community 5 miles down the road to get a new water tower. It's a horrible situation that needs to be corrected. This may not be exactly what this hearing is about, but this creates one of the biggest obstacles to providing at least it still wouldn't be sufficient housing dollars or dollars to fight poverty, but it is a serious problem. Thank you very much. My time is up. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Hill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cleaver, and first let me thank you for your chairmanship of this subcommittee during this Congress and for our work together and for your outstanding voice for the challenges in this subcommittee, particularly in housing and community development with your background, both in Congress and as a mayor. And while the bills that were noticed attached to this hearing aren't bipartisan and have much bipartisan engagement, I would say, I hope in the coming Congress that we'll be able to work effectively together in a bipartisan way. Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent to enter 2 documents into the record, both from the U.S. Government Accountability Office. The first is entitled Targeting Federal Funds, Information on Funding to Areas with Persistent or High Poverty by GAO's Director of Financial Markets and Community Investment, Bill Scheer, and others. It was issued in July 2020. And the second is also by Director Scheer and his GAO colleagues. It's called Areas with High Poverty, Changing How the 10-20-30 Funding Formula is Applied and Could Increase Impact in Persistent Poverty Counties, that was issued in May of 2021.
Without objection.
You know, both of these reports are focused on the economic development in areas with persistent or high poverty and discuss how to improve ways various programs could target federal funds and overall transparency. And I noted in the reports that GAO has found that HUD, USDA, the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration, EDA, have not, and I'm quoting from the report, not incorporated leading practices for effective interagency collaboration in select economic development programs. Mr. George, what's your view of that? Could we do a better job of interagency coordination to laser beam all these programs into these counties?
Thank you, Ranking Member Hill. I agree that there could be more coordination and more effort generally. I do think the agencies try really hard and are making sound investments in these communities. There are some instances that were noted in the testimony where there was a lack of adequate staffing and resources in some of these agencies to direct those funds, but by all means, we think collaboration is a good effort across the board among the agencies.
Thank you. Mr. Burt, first, please tell Bill Bynum hello for me. We were on the CDFI advisory board together in the early 2000s and enjoyed my association with him in overseeing the CDFI program at the Treasury. And thank you for being a good investor and partner in Arkansas with Hope Federal Credit Union and your nonprofit work. What's your view of that coordination? I hear you on down payment assistance, and in Arkansas, and talking to the Arkansas Development Finance Agency, we have really, we use the bond program to replenish that. We effectively have more down payment assistance available than people applying for it. As a general statement, I don't want to say in any given year, but we have a robust state program there. But how do you feel about this coordination of these federal programs in persistent counties, about coordination, and who stands out? Does the Delta Regional Authority help broker some of that in your experience in the Mississippi Delta?
No, absolutely. We do support the interagency collaboration in deploying funds to communities that are deep in poverty. One of the things that we like to highlight is making sure that federal funds get to the communities that do the best work in serving these communities. as evidenced by the emergency rental assistance program, and in some cases, the homeowner assistance program, is that at times our states may have the inability or unwillingness to effectively serve these communities. From our experience, we saw communities and households express challenges in accessing the rental assistance program, whether it be through an online application or having to have an email address or simply lacking access from state agencies that were managing the funds to actually access that critical relief. But in addition to that, what we also like to amplify is that where there is opportunity, send these funds directly to CDFIs with a strong track record. We have a good example of the ways in which CDFIs have the ability to encourage public and philanthropic dollars to make a difference in homeownership in real communities. This question reminds me of the story of Eastmore, Mississippi, a small subdivision in Moorhead, which is a small town of about 2,000 people in the Delta. In 1970, Eastmore subdivision was built right outside of the small town of Moorhead, hastily construction. In the subsequent years, the sewage actually seeped into several yards and caused about 20-something odd homes to be either burned or destroyed. In 2015, Hope put a branch there in Moorhead, and we reached out to several partners and got a grant from Goldman Sachs, got money from Home Fund, got money from Department of Agriculture, and with a few other philanthropic investors, but a few other philanthropic monies, we were able to provide rehabilitated housing for that community. That was 44 houses rehabilitated. That was 44 households that became homeowners. So when we talk about the ways in which interagencies could collaborate or think about the ways in which we could bring about greater resources to these communities, you have to include CDFIs with a strong track record, and you have to include getting the money directly to those.
Thank you, Mr. Burt. The time is over, but thank you, Mr. Cleaver. I thought your answer was very, very helpful, and I yield back. Thank you for the hearing.
Thank you. I yield now to the chair of the full committee, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much. Since Mr. Hill started talking about whether or not there's cooperation between the agencies, and Mr. Burt mentioned how it became difficult to get rental assistance out into the community. Let me ask you, do you believe that poor communities that do not have access to computers, do not have access to the technology that is oftentimes needed in order to make application for some of what we're sending to the cities or the counties or the states? And what do you think we can do about that if you believe that is true?
Well, I do think it is a challenge. I mean, that's come from my experience being on the ground with communities trying to access the rental assistance programs. You know, one of the things we want to do is partner with organizations and also raise advocacy efforts to get those technologies to these communities. And even more importantly, making sure that these programs are just simply accessible to the communities where they are. And so, just simply put, when we construct policies and construct these federal programs that we put in jurisdiction of the states, we want to make sure the states are doing what they need to do to make sure the the most vulnerable communities have access to these critical funds in the post-COVID reality.
Thank you very much. Mr. George, how would housing and community development investments like the more than $150 billion my committee secured in the Build Back Better Act help alleviate persistent poverty in rural America? And what more can we do to ensure existing federal housing resources really reach poor rural communities?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. I'd like to follow on Mr. Burke's comments candidly and say our number one strategy that we posed was organizational capacity. At the Housing Assistance Council, we work with local community-based organizations, nonprofit organizations, municipalities, tribal entities, and some for-profit developers. And candidly, they know what's best for their community. We just try to enhance their services and their ability to provide those services. But they're trusted actors in these communities, and I applaud the subcommittee for including many of these entities in this discussion. These are valuable partners that we work with every day, and they really know so I think our goal is to enhance those funds to enhance the capacity of those local community-based organizations. For example, the Housing Assistance Council uses vital resources from HUD's Rural Capacity Building Grant, and we've made valuable investments in many of these organizations because they know
So
what's best.
the $150 billion that we worked so hard for to get out to assist the housing needs of this country, everything from Section 8 vouchers to money to deal with the renovation and repair of public housing, on and on and on. How much would that have helped the poverty in some of the communities that you deal with?
Well, it'll obviously been immense help. It's almost incalculable, but obviously these communities need all the assistance and all the directed, targeted assistance that they can handle.
Well, we're going to continue to fight for housing despite the fact we did not get the support that was needed from the opposite side of the aisle. But on this issue of whether or not the resources we work so hard for, if we get them signed by the president, they go out to the communities, we still have poor communities who are not able to access these resources for lack of computers and technology. And I had to call in legal aid in Los Angeles and set up meetings and get people into boardrooms, et cetera, to try and help people who needed it so desperately. What are we going to do? Do we have enough nonprofits that can, basically utilize these resources and get them out to the poverty communities? Or do we need to set up some brick and mortar offices and locations with big signs on them so people can come and get some help for the utilization of the resource? What do you think? How are we going to do it? My time's running out. I know you got some
Oh,
answers.
I was about to say, I'll take it. Again, I think the point to be made is that we want to make sure that state leadership is doing all that they can to reach the communities that are most in need. I mean, when you talk about the challenges around broadband and technology, I mean, money's already been deployed to get these communities the technology that they need. And so some of this is on nonprofits, but the brunt of the responsibility lies on the administrating authority over the fund. And so I would say we can continue to put pressure on our states to do right by the communities that need it with research, advocacy, and data. Then I think that may be one of the best ways forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver and Ranking Member Hill, for holding this hearing. According to the majority's memorandum for this hearing, the focus of the hearing is intended to explore persistent poverty in regions that are predominantly rural. So I believe that it would have been a good idea for us to have the Rural Housing Service Administrator testify. I'll note that this committee has not had a Biden administration official testify since July 20th. Thankfully, that's changing tomorrow when we will have the bank regulators coming before the committee, but this cannot continue. One of our core responsibilities as members of Congress is oversight, and we cannot conduct adequate oversight when the majority is shielding the administration from scrutiny. Now that, as time is limited, I'll dive right into my questions. In my district in Middle Tennessee, 12.9% of total occupied housing units are manufactured homes. Manufactured housing is an affordable home ownership option available nationwide for minorities, the underserved, and low-income borrowers. USDA's Section 502 offers federal backing for loans issued by approved private sector lenders to low and moderate income families for purchase, construction, or rehabilitation of modest homes. Eligible borrowers can obtain financing for up to 100% of the appraised value of the home. New manufactured homes are currently eligible for financing through the Section 502 program, but existing homes are not. Mr. Potterpin, do we need to make sure that USDA's Section 502 program better supports manufactured housing so that more low and moderate income rural Americans can access financing to purchase manufactured homes?
I think absolutely. I think that we need to make sure that all of USDA's programs need more access, 502, 514, 515, better funding and more access to folks to provide more housing units and to preserve more housing units.
Thank you. I believe that we need broad-based solutions to increase our housing supply to meet demand. This includes both single and multifamily options. Regarding multifamily, research from the National Association of Home Builders and the National Multifamily Housing Council notes that regulations imposed by all levels of government accounts for an average of 40.6% of multifamily development cost. Mr. Potterpin, do you believe that when multifamily development costs rise, it translates to higher rents and reduced rental housing affordability?
Yes, it does. And I would also add that rural areas are impacted even greater because their rents are typically lower. But when the costs rise, as they do everywhere, and we have less options for contractors or competitive bidding, they're feeling the impact even greater, and the rents go up a greater percentage. That's why it's important to improve rental assistance and the amount of assisted units and have more access for these funds.
And so just to reiterate, Mr. Potterpin, do you believe that multifamily development could help improve the supply of affordable housing in rural areas?
No question at all. Yes, it's desperately needed in almost every rural area. And with minimal investment into these programs, we can leverage private dollars on an average of $7 to $11 for every dollar invested to create more units.
The Community Development Block Grant Program was created to help urban areas modernize and respond to the blight and decay that plagued cities in the 1970s. The authorizing statute states that the primary objective of the law was to establish the development of viable urban communities. Since then, cities now have far greater access to economic development and services than their much smaller rural neighbors. Mr. Potterpin, does it make sense to update the mission and purpose of the CDBG program so that it also focuses on the unique challenges rural Americans living in the 21st century?
CAR would welcome this being addressed. The challenges of rural are different and sometimes greater than those facing their urban counterparts. And I think we need to update this so that we can achieve easier access to these funds. As was noted elsewhere in this hearing, rural municipalities often have less resources to pursue funds and compete for funds than their urban counterparts, so they're at a disadvantage, and they need more assistance in doing so and a level playing field.
Thank you. And Chairman, I see my time has expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Small Business, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this important hearing. Professor Bonilla, I agree with you in terms of how poverty in Puerto Rico is directly linked to the colonial situation of Puerto Rico, and that Congress has a responsibility for resolving this issue. After following Hurricane Maria in 2017, under President Trump's leadership, HUD imposed unique restrictions and stalled almost $20 billion in federal disaster funding to Puerto Rico. President Biden has since removed this restriction, but can you explain how President Trump's decision to set up roadblocks and make it difficult for Puerto Rico to access disaster funding in 2017 has compounded its current recovery efforts?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. The Trump administration engaged in practices of over-scrutiny of applicants of color and put excessive barriers on applications for aid on behalf of both individuals and the Puerto Rican government. Some of these measures were placed in the name of preventing corruption, but it is important to mention that the only people who have been accused of corruption in the wake of Maria have been FEMA agents and contractors. The delay of federal aid and of federal assistance programs to which Puerto Ricans are fully entitled to as residents of the U.S. territories have caused an incalculable damage to a society that was already, as I mentioned, experiencing 40% of acute poverty, and that had already been facing measures of austerity that had dismantled the education system, public infrastructure, and other public services that were then unable to respond and be available to citizens in the time of immediate emergency. At the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, we call on greater scrutiny of these FEMA practices and of the practices of other government agencies that should be assisting Puerto Ricans in their time of need.
Thank you. Professor, one of the issues facing Puerto Rico after the most recent hurricane is the lack of specific data on how low-income Black and rural communities remain at a disadvantage on the island. What should Congress do to immediately address this information gap so it can enhance long-term investment in these communities?
Well, the first issue is that we need clarity on why certain government agencies just suddenly stop providing data for the territory. One example is the American Housing Survey, which just stopped being done in Puerto Rico after Maria at a time when this info was most necessary for documenting the challenges of local residents. A second example is the Household Pulse Survey, another important survey which not one territory has participated in. We also need greater data related to FEMA claims. It is difficult to know where and who was denied and who did not have access to aid. 60% of applicants were denied, and there is really no transparency as to how those decisions are made. I should also add that federal agencies should be working with local groups to make sure that the existing mechanisms are adequate for the territories. A primary example is the U.S. Census, which in 2020 suddenly added a race question in Puerto Rico with inadequate categories and inadequate education campaigns. So we really stress the need for that. Yes.
So although FEMA updated its policy last year to allow homeowners to self-certify their own ownership, reports from the ground indicate FEMA is wrongfully denying assistance to eligible survivors from Hurricanes Fiona and Ian. Wouldn't you agree it's not enough for FEMA to simply change its policy, but it also needs to act with recovery partners on the ground to ensure Puerto Rico homeowners get the assistance to which they are entitled?
Absolutely. We've seen that simply changing policy is not enough. The community organizations on the ground are reporting that we are seeing the exact same issues of lack of Spanish translation at FEMA sites, of lack of interpretation for deaf communities, and of over scrutiny and of a demand of documentation that is not actually necessary to apply for aid. As one of my colleagues in Puerto Rico says, FEMA must learn how to learn. That is, they cannot be impervious to change. Made at the top that are announced need to somehow trickle down so that we actually see them applied and in action. And we feel strongly that it is only by working in partnership with community watchdogs that we can actually ascertain if these changes are being implemented.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for calling today's hearing. Entrenched multi-generational poverty, an incredibly serious challenge in many parts of our country. It's true of the areas listed in the hearing title, but it's also true in rural and urban communities in Wisconsin, in my home state. As many of you may know, or some may know, I'm the ranking member on the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth, what I call the economy. And we've really dug into the impact of persistent poverty that is plaguing far too many American families. Interestingly, in one of the areas we went to was a Colonias in Texas on the U.S.-Mexico border. And interestingly, we saw kind of the direct impacts that the failure to secure the U.S.-Mexico border has had on a lot of the local communities in Texas, where they're expending resources at the local and state level for what should be a national solution to that challenge that'd actually be far better off serving many of the people who are suffering from the topic we're discussing today. Let me shift gears slightly to you, Mr. Potterpin. Your company specializes in developing projects using low-income housing tax credits, historic preservation tax credits, new market and opportunity zone programs. Could you offer a few recommendations and improvements to those programs that make it easier for developers to add affordable units of more challenged communities or in more challenged communities?
Absolutely. Thank you. A lot of these, the changes that I would recommend were actually proposed and are still exist in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. That act would have expanded the 9% housing tax credit by 50%. Also would have increased rural basis boost, or offered a rural basis boost of up to 30%, offering more credits to those. And that's essential to allowing rural deals to compete federally on bond deals, 4% credit deals, where many of the rural deals with lower rents don't pencil for those types of credits. That the development deals don't make sense with a 30% boost. Many deals now would and would offer preservation. Additionally, one other thing that's being discussed right now that would be very helpful is reducing the bond test from 50% to 25%, essentially doubling the capacity of 4% credits in each state. Many states which are now using all of their allocation. All of these would offer a lot more units and, again, leverage a lot of private dollars to provide them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Potterpin. If I can ask you another question, but let me shift gears somewhat significantly. We've talked a lot about government intervention, often in our more urban areas or denser population areas. I know your business also does a lot of work in rural America. Shifting away from just government support, what are the chief problems you encounter when your firm's investing in rural communities, and what can be done to encourage more investment in more rural or less dense populated areas?
Well, I think a lot of what we're facing, especially in the affordable housing world, where we have to work with the communities very closely. Sometimes we need, we're offering lower rent communities, so we need tax abatement or other assistance or at least cooperation from those communities. And those communities often don't have the staff or the resources that urban communities do to facilitate the development and make it more open.
Let me push you there just a little bit if I can. What areas outside of government intervention might be helpful, in particular in rural areas? Understanding the impact that tax structuring can have.
Sure. Well, in many areas, most communities are often dependent on one big supplier or job supplier. So those areas are dependent on that, and it is hard to underwrite or solicit investment. So if we can find ways to broaden the supply base of jobs and the infrastructure, especially infrastructure where it is hard to, oftentimes we're coming from if we're looking to develop in rural communities, the water infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure, the other infrastructure that's necessary to provide amenities and provide housing for those residents, it does not exist. So other ways to do that would be to improve that infrastructure there, or we can work directly with job suppliers to also build.
Thank you very much, Mr. Potterman. I appreciate you and all of our witnesses here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's hearing. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, who is the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, let me say thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses present and on the screen. Thank you for allowing us to have the opportunity to take a look at persistent poverty in America in those areas as cited in the hearing. Let me also say thank you. I'm sorry our chair of the larger committee is not here, but certainly we did hear from the Biden administration, and most of us will know no one has been a bigger advocate for housing than Congresswoman Maxine Waters and you, Mr. Chairman. And I was very pleased when our HUD director came before the Financial Services Committee, Biden's administration, just for the record, and talked about the $3.8 billion in CDBG, and also specifically said that their area of interest in housing included working in those underserved areas in cities, small towns, quote, rural areas. So I think we know where the Biden administration stands on that. My first question will go to you, Mr. Burt, and I want to make the connectivity to when we talk about housing, especially in the southern states, that we tie it to the racial wealth gap. And certainly we know that it's important to increase home ownership for Black Americans. And when we think about places like Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas, I noticed most of you talked about those southern states and talked about the percentage of poverty for the nation coming from those southern states in rural areas. The renowned Brian Stevenson said, the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but it's justice. So when I look at home ownership, I look at the disparities. I look at whether those are in Black communities, in urban or rural areas. Certainly, we have a lot of our members who represent rural areas and also are members of the Congressional Black Caucus. So let me ask this question. Can you explain why median home values in Black communities are significantly lower than outside of the belt, and the effect that this has had on the racial wealth gap?
Yes, I can. Effectively, in the Deep South, this is the region that holds the Black Belt, these counties that are majority persons of color. It's not unusual to see that they have higher rates of home ownership in the region, given that a lot of the housing stock is actually passed down generation to generation. The issue is that because of historical challenges of, again, financial lending exclusion, redlining, and the lack of access to affordable financial mortgages, the quality of housing hasn't kept up with the pace of home ownership. So said more simply, is that Black communities that are in persistent poverty, rural counties, may have a house, but they don't have the capital, the access to capital to get renovations, or they don't have access to get capital to get the pull equity and increase their equity out of the same housing stock. So in short, what we see with home ownership, we actually see that it's really a function of the lack of affordable financial mortgages. And even beyond that, when we talk about persistent poverty counties, we realize that of the 158 counties that have an unbanked and underbanked rate, 1.5 times the national average, 75% of those counties are persistent poverty counties. Again, persistent poverty counties in our region are majority persons of color, and they're more likely to be rural. So what we see is an intersection of the compounding impact of the lack of investment into these communities. So it's affecting not only their ability to get a home mortgage or become a homeowner, but it's also—
I'm going to have to stop you because my clock is running out, but that was very helpful. Mr. George, kind of to segue from that, what do you think some of the things we can do to boost home ownership to loans in the southern Black Belt regions? And I say that because we know the small number of MDIs that we have, CDFIs. What are some of the things you think we can do?
Thank you, Congressman. Obviously, to reiterate the comment on access to capital is a major strategy. And notably, what we would call good capital, improve resources to USDA's Rural Development Service, so borrowers can get good quality loans and not access to subprime loans or chattel loans in many cases.
Thank you. My time has run out, but you can write me more if you'd like. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from San Diego. Mr. Vargas, you now have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member and all of the witnesses today. HUD defines colonias as communities located within a 150-mile region along the U.S.-Mexico border that, quote, lack adequate water, sewer, or decent housing, or a combination of all three. Ms. Arriaga-Salinas, you noted that Colonias suffer from persistent poverty, limited access to healthcare, public transportation, and flooding due to lack of adequate infrastructure. What can Congress do to prioritize the voices of individuals that live in your community as well as Colonias? In my home state of California, in my district is currently the entire California-Mexico border, and all of it is within 150 miles of the border. What can we do?
I think that there are quite a few things that can be done. Coming from a nonprofit, I think giving opportunities to nonprofits and local voices is very important. For Colonias, I think the challenges are very unique. There are, monies that were mentioned today that would assist with rental assistance or to make other developments. However, in Colonias, we cannot use vouchers for that because people are renting a dilapidated mobile home or a shed. That is their rental unit. There is no way for them to be able to access vouchers when that is their option. There aren't enough funds for people to rehabilitate their homes. And one of the challenges that we see is that as these colonias are annexed into cities, they are not seeing the benefits. They are not seeing the infrastructure improvements, but their taxes are going up. And I think that when a colonia is no longer under that designation, but they're annexed into the city, the term rural goes away. And we are not allowed to use rural development monies, 502s, and things like that, because there is population growth, but the housing and the infrastructure has not changed. And I think that that is something that absolutely needs to be addressed. When the term colonia dissipates the amount of funds that we're able to use, that makes it much more challenging. So I think that recognizing the unique problems in colonias would make a great deal of change.
First of all, thank you for that answer. But let me challenge you a little bit on the definition of colonia, because again, colonia's the definition helps in my district. But frankly, the Central Valley of California has what I would consider colonias, but it's beyond the 150-mile area of the border. Do you think that some of those areas should be designated as colonias? Why or why not?
I absolutely do. I recognize that communities that haven't been able to improve their infrastructure need the change, because if there is severe weather that affects them and the infrastructure is not in place to address that, then the potential damage is just magnified. And I feel that that would be very beneficial.
The severe weather oftentimes in Central California is the lack of water, interestingly. So it's not the flooding because there's too much water, it's the lack of water that goes the other way. Mr. George said that the $150 billion that we put in the Build Back Better and that our chair fought so hard for would help immensely, almost incalculably. Mr. Potterpin, you also said that the leverage ratio would be 1 to 7 in some instances. Could you tell us then what you think, Mr. Potterpin, that money could have gone for, or how helpful it would have been for this persistent poverty?
I concur with Mr. George. Almost incalculable, the amounts that were talked about when looking at those budgets for Build Back Better, specifically in the RD. What was slated for the rural development budget at that point for the 515 and 521 programs was almost 20 years of normal funding in 1 year. And it would have, these properties are falling behind through deferred maintenance every year. There's not enough money to even maintain what's there, and this would have put them back on the right track for preserving this entire portfolio.
I'm running out of time, and thank you very much. I hope we do that. I think the problem was the name. We should call it the Republican plan and just pass it. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I have just several questions and comments directed toward Ms. Bonilla. One of the persistent causes, one of the root causes of persistent poverty in Puerto Rico is the insular cases, which to me represents a continuation of Jim Crow. Denouncing the insular cases as a vestige of Jim Crow is not hyperbole, it's a statement of historical fact. The Supreme Court that gave us Plessy versus Ferguson and the doctrine of separate but equal is the same court that gave us the insular cases, which imposes second-class status on the U.S. citizens of U.S. territories. There are more than 3 million American citizens of Puerto Rico deprived of equal protection simply because those citizens happen to live in an unincorporated territory, which is a second-class status fabricated by the United States Supreme Court. The term unincorporated territory appears nowhere in the actual text of the Constitution, and yet the self-proclaimed textualist and originalist on the Supreme Court seem to be in no rush to overturn the insular cases. How telling. As you know, Ms. Bonilla, the insular cases enable the federal government to discriminate against the American citizens of Puerto Rico. The American citizens of Puerto Rico are excluded from SSI, excluded from SNAP, excluded from their fair share of Medicaid funding, excluded from far too many programs to enumerate. Do you think there's a single state in the United States that could absorb the fiscal shock of losing all of its SSI funding, all of its SNAP funding, and most of its Medicaid funding? Can you think of a single state that could absorb those fiscal shocks?
Obviously not. Obviously not.
So is it reasonable to expect Puerto Rico to suffer fiscal conditions and constraints that not even the wealthiest states like New York or California could survive?
Absolutely not.
And the federal government denies Puerto Rico access to federal programs that are crucial to the fiscal sovereignty of just about every state. Is it fair to say that the United States, by denying the island access to that which is essential, has essentially set up Puerto Rico to fail?
It has set it up to fail, but it has set it up to succeed as a colony, which is what the United States wishes to hold it as, since it's what it continues to replicate in Puerto Rico and in the other U.S. territories.
Do you believe, as I do, that overturning the insular cases is necessary for the recovery of the island?
Honestly, this might surprise you, but I don't think it's necessary because it is, in fact, just an excuse. I think it would help remove the excuses that the U.S. government uses to keep treating Puerto Rico differently. But the fact is that the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress could begin to treat Puerto Rico differently today. It doesn't have to remove the insular cases in order to do that. Do I think it's a racist law that brings shame to the U.S. government? Yes, but I don't think it's more than just an excuse for the conditions that are currently in place.
As you might know, the Jones Act is a third rail in American politics. Congress is fiercely protective of the Jones Act, which discriminates against Puerto Rico. What are your thoughts on the disparate impact of the Jones Act on the island?
Without a doubt, the Jones Act brings nothing but increased cost to a place that is experiencing persistent, acute, and systemic poverty across every single one of its counties and municipios. The problem with the Jones Act is that it's not a partisan issue. It does not impact one party or another and has not been taken up by one party or another. But the fact is that the only folks who benefit from the Jones Act are the shipping industry in the United States. And so it does need to be brought into greater scrutiny and questioned and repealed.
Not every state and territory are subject to the Jones Act. Both Puerto Rico and Hawaii have the highest electricity cost in the United States, and both Puerto Rico and Hawaii are subject to the Jones Act. Do you think that's a coincidence?
No, obviously there are folks that are benefiting from the extreme costs that are spent in transporting goods to these places. However, I think it's important to recognize that some folks benefit, but this does not benefit the U.S. economy as a whole, since it actually makes it more expensive for many U.S. businesses to operate in Puerto Rico because of these excessive shipping costs.
My time has expired. Thank you.
Mr. Torres yields back. We have no further witnesses unless Mr. Huizenga from Michigan, he's checked out. Let me thank the witnesses for your testimony, your participation today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to email addresses provided to your office. This hearing is now adjourned.